Content warning. This episode contains discussion of the murder of 2 girls, violence, and severe mental illnesses and disorders.
Lately, the subject of mental illness has become a major topic among those following the Delphi murders. That is due to developments in the case against Richard or Rick Allen, the man charged with murdering Liberty German and Abigail Williams. Specifically, it's because of the emergency motion to modify safekeeping order that defense attorney Brad Rosie filed on April 5, 2023. Here are the relevant paragraphs.
To further complicate matters, Mr. Allen has suffered from depression dating back to his early years. Upon his incarceration, Mr. Allen was presumably evaluated and medicated by prison medical staff. Up until the visit with Mr. Allen on April 4, 2023, counsel for Mr. Allen found him to be polite, communicative, with great eye contact, generally responsive to our questions, and exhibiting good sense of humor on occasion in spite of his false arrest and circumstances. However, Mr. Allen's deteriorating physical condition has been observed by counsel dating back to the beginning of the new year. As recently as Friday, March 24, 2023, attorney Andrew Baldwin met with Mr. Allen with optimistic news about the direction of the case, and Mr. Allen was inquisitive about the information, was thankful about the information, and optimistic about the information. Only 10 days later, April 3, 2023, attorneys for Mr. Allen observed steep decline in Mr. Allen's demeanor, ability to communicate, ability to comprehend, and ability to assist in his defense. Simply put, this version of Richard Allen was a very different version than counsel for Mr. Allen had interacted with over the past 5 months. Mr. Allen appeared to be suffering from various psychotic symptoms, which counsel would describe as schizophrenic and delusional. Counsel further believes that in our April 4, 2023 interaction, Mr. Allen seems to be suffering from memory loss and is demonstrating an overall inability to communicate rationally with counsel and family members. Counsel experienced these symptoms firsthand upon visiting Mr. Allen on Monday, April 4, 2023.
The filing contains troubling allegations about Allen's time in Westville Prison, but the details about his mental health state also raise concerns and questions. Ever since this filing came out, a discussion over Allen's mental health has taken hold. In this episode, we'll have an expert in this field on our show to discuss all the nuances here. This licensed mental health counselor will speak to us about schizophrenia, psychosis, and Allen's alleged behaviors as described in the filing. My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
We first connected while looking into the Burger Chef murders, an Indiana cold case. Together, we built a spreadsheet documenting hundreds of cases of restaurant-related homicides. That original spreadsheet gave way to our podcast, The Murder Sheet.
Now we maintain that same research-centric, investigative approach as we look into all sorts of homicides, including unsolved cases, historical crimes, and, of course, restaurant murders.
We don't just chat about the headlines. Our podcast is a platform for our journalism. The Murder Sheet focuses on investigative reporting, thoughtful analysis, thorough research, and in-depth interviews.
We're The Murder Sheet, and this is
The Delphi Murders, Richard Allen's Steep Decline, a conversation with a licensed mental health counselor.
Today we'll be speaking with someone who has worked in the mental health space for around a decade. She's certified in Indiana as a licensed mental health counselor and she has some experience working in the justice system with juveniles. She's also done a lot of crisis work in her time.
We'll call our expert Sarah. That's not her real name. She's still working in this space and is therefore cautious about using her name. We never want anyone to suffer negative repercussions for talking to us, so we agreed to keep her anonymous. We did verify her identity and her work credentials.
Before we get into our discussion, let's just go through a few important items. Sarah is a mental health professional. She's not going to attempt to diagnose anyone from afar.
In fact, there's a bit of a history around the ethical guidelines of diagnosing a public figure without ever having interacted with them. During the 1964 presidential campaign, there was an infamous incident where thousands of psychiatrists were asked if candidate Barry Goldwater was, quote, psychologically fit to serve as president of the United States. That gave way to the American Psychiatric Association's so-called Goldwater Rule of 1973. Here's the text of that ethical rule for public figures.
It is unethical for a psychiatrist to offer a professional opinion unless he or she has conducted an examination and has been granted proper authorization for such a statement.
Now, the Goldwater Rule only applies to psychiatrists who belong to the American Psychiatric Association. Sarah's not a psychiatrist. There's no one rule for all mental health professionals, and some have argued that the Goldwater Rule is overly strict.
Then again, we feel more comfortable in this instance sticking with a more conservative approach to this discussion. We simply don't have enough information to make sweeping guesses about Alan's mental health.
Instead, we wanted to stick with the facts, as they are described in the emergency filing. So keep in mind a few things. Nobody knows with certainty much about Alan's mental health history, or any potential past diagnoses or lack thereof, aside from what's listed in the filing. The only hint we have involves Rosie's note that Alan, quote, suffered from depression dating back to his early years, although we don't know what formal diagnoses went along with that or any past treatment methods he underwent for the condition.
Another important matter. Alan is presumed innocent until proven guilty. He has not been convicted, nor has he pleaded guilty. He is currently awaiting trial. We do not presume to know the extent of the case against him, and therefore must reserve judgment.
We want to approach this topic with nuance, so it bears stating that it's possible for a factually innocent man to deal with issues like schizophrenia or psychosis. It's also possible for a factually guilty man to feel, well, guilty about committing a heinous crime. We don't feel it's appropriate for any of us on the outside to attempt to use this filing as a means of trying to speculate about guilt or innocence. We're journalists, not Roman haruspices, trying to predict the future using gross, ridiculous, and inaccurate methods. Let's just treat this as what it is, an emergency filing dealing with a man who may be in a mental health crisis, and talk about some of the terms included in the document, namely the terms schizophrenic and psychotic that Rosie used to describe Alan's behavior.
For her part, Sarah was somewhat surprised by the list of clinical terms included in the filing. We started off by getting into a discussion about the colloquialization of certain clinical terms.
There kind of needs to be a conversation about mental health and terminology. So there are a lot of terms that have found their way into casual conversation. They've been colloquialized, if you will. And that's great in the sense that it kind of normalizes some conditions and it serves to destigmatize mental health conditions. But it also has a detrimental effect because what happens is, take bipolar, for example. I hear people all the time throwing out the word bipolar in casual conversation. Bipolar is a complex condition. You know, there are lots of different things that it encompasses. But when people use it in casual conversation, what they've done is they've basically boiled it down to the most defining feature of bipolar, which for most people would be moodiness. And so they throw that word out. And when we do that, people lose sight of the fact that bipolar is nuanced. It's a spectrum of symptoms, and it's not just being moody. There's a lot more to it. We see this with ADHD is another one, right? People use it as interchangeable with, oh, I'm having trouble focusing, I'm ADHD today. It's a lot more than that. So when these words find their way into casual conversation, I think the population can lose sight of what these conditions actually are and what they encompass.
In this case, we're talking about a person where none of us know if he does have any previous diagnoses as far as mental health goes. You know, we're not going to make any assumptions, but at the same time, it could be interesting to discuss things like schizophrenia and psychosis and how they might come up in this situation. And I guess maybe we start off by asking you, how did this filing strike you and what sort of things stood out to you as a mental health professional?
It was specifically the complaint that was alleging more that Rick Allen has been so extremely impacted by his environment that he's now developed what the defense attorney referred to as, I think it was schizophrenic and delusional behavior. There was an earlier reference to psychotic symptoms as well. And these are different things. But the first question that I had that obviously wasn't addressed in that filing was, what's happening? Like, what are you seeing that's leading you to make this assertion? Because this is a lawyer, not a clinician. I'm not saying that this man doesn't have the knowledge to kind of back up the statement. He might, but that's not his field of expertise. So I would want to know if the behavior he's alluding to even falls into what we would consider actual psychotic symptoms. And then to take the psychotic symptoms and kind of generalize it to say schizophrenic behavior, that's a leap for me. Psychosis and schizophrenia are different. They're not interchangeable. Schizophrenia is a condition. Again, it encompasses more than just one thing. That's a dilution of what it is to boil it down to psychosis, delusions, hallucinations, stuff like that. So the proper term would be psychosis. If someone was hallucinating, if they were hearing or seeing things that weren't there, that's psychosis. Psychosis, the presence of psychosis, is not a straight line to schizophrenia. I would need to know before I even got to schizophrenia, is this person on medication? Has this medication recently been changed or altered in any way? Because medications can induce psychosis. I would want to know, have there been any physical altercations? If this person has sustained a blow to the head, this could be more manifestation of a concussion or something going on in the brain. There are lots of different things I would need to rule out before I could even bring the term schizophrenia into the equation. So it struck me as odd and perhaps strategic that a lawyer would assert that a behavior is schizophrenic without having done some more investigation first, I guess.
Is it possible that it's maybe being used as shorthand, as we sort of mentioned, as sometimes mental health diagnoses are for, something like erratic behavior or psychosis, even though obviously it's not the same thing?
It's possible. It's possible it can be schizophrenic could have been used more as like an adjective. Mm-hmm. It's rare, but I have heard people refer to behavior as schizophrenic as kind of interchangeable with what they consider to be erratic behavior. So that's definitely a possibility. I thought it might be more to do with, again, public perception of those two words. If I were to talk about someone who's schizophrenic, that's going to typically evoke more of a sympathetic response from the lay population. When people hear schizophrenia, they think a lot of the time, like, this is a person suffering from a condition, they're struggling with it, they're fighting against it, they're doing their best. So there's a lot of empathy kind of associated with schizophrenic, in my opinion. Whereas the word psychotic really has a different connotation for the lay population. If you think about a time that you might have referred to someone as psychotic, can you remember what kind of behavior they might have been displaying at that time?
Oh, yes. Certainly not very, positive behavior, I think, in anybody's view. It's more used, I feel like, as an insult almost, or kind of denigrating someone.
Exactly. So the lay population kind of associates the term psychotic more with deviant behavior or with violent behavior. So I possibly think the focus on schizophrenic behavior could have been a conscious attempt of a defense attorney to cast his client in a more positive light, whereas calling it by the proper term, which again, misunderstood by the lay population, might leave people with an impression that this is a violent guy, if that makes sense.
Right. So there is an element of, maybe looking for a synonym, even if it's not a great fit. Maybe it doesn't denigrate somebody or cast them, as you said, maybe as violent. Like the word choice is imperative there. I wanted to ask you, if we could get into, I guess, the broad definitions of schizophrenia and psychosis, and, what exactly do they mean? And maybe then we can start to unpack some of the baggage around these terms.
Yeah. So schizophrenia is a condition. So it is essentially a collection of symptoms. It's really characterized, it's a brain disorder, and it's people who have something going on in their brains that leaves them unable to perceive and interpret reality, essentially. And so this inability to accurately perceive reality results in a lot of impairment in, their daily life. They have trouble sustaining social relationships. They kind of might seem erratic. They might behave kind of strangely. So fundamentally, it's a disconnection from reality. Psychosis is a term for a collection of specific symptoms. Psychosis is not a diagnosable condition. Rather, it is a symptom of schizophrenia, but it is also a symptom that can be associated with other psychiatric disorders. So psychosis does not equal schizophrenia, but schizophrenia most of the time involves psychosis.
What other disorders can result in psychosis?
Bipolar disorder, you can definitely have with psychotic features. PTSD sometimes will have some elements of it. Substance use disorders, definitely, you'll see it. Even, I guess, if you think about it, older age, disorders of older age, dementia, you have some of those elements in there.
When it comes to psychosis, I suppose, why do you think that has kind of had so much baggage attached to it as far as the negative perception?
I think it might be fear, honestly. When people think of, again, psychosis, so psychosis would be actively seeing something that's not there, hearing something that's not there. Psychosis would also include having delusions. I think people see these, or they've been exposed to these symptoms in a way that makes them fear for themselves. You see someone on the street having a conversation with no one, right? And I think it's natural to a certain degree to kind of want to keep your distance because you think, well, this person, something's clearly wrong. That could mean something happens to me as a result. I think pop culture also plays into it. Unfortunately, not all depictions of mental illness in movies and TV shows are the kindest. I can think of probably a dozen episodes of Law and Order SVU where the person who has committed the crime happens to be a person with mental illness or schizophrenia specifically. So I think a lot of pop culture also plays into people's perception of what these disorders are.
Right. And I really appreciate you kind of boiling it down that like schizophrenia often includes psychosis, but psychosis is not the definition. They're separate, and one is more of a symptom and another one is more of a condition, as you said. I mean, I guess broadening that out, what other elements of schizophrenia sort of go beyond the element of just psychosis?
Psychosis is basically always present in schizophrenia, and that's why they are so strongly linked, because it is kind of the hallmark feature. So delusions will be in there too. There's also usually a general air of disorganization, so what we'd call disorganized thinking or disorganized speech. It's very loose association. So sometimes we'll call it word salad. You'll have someone with schizophrenia try and have a conversation with you, but they're not making sense. They're giving you bits of phrases and words, and then the next thing out of their mouth is something that you might find completely unrelated. So the brain kind of functions on loose associations, and it makes perfect sense to them, but doesn't always make sense to the other people. So that will happen both in their thinking and their speech pattern. You'll also see that they refer to as abnormal motor behavior, unpredictable movements, weird body postures. This, I think, might be more kind of in eccentric behavior, kind of how you might categorize it. And there's also what we would refer to as negative symptoms, so lack of things that are usually there. So that might be the ability to maintain hygiene, expressing emotion, eye contact, affect, facial expressions. So again, these negative symptoms are not specific to schizophrenia. They probably sound familiar. You can see them in lots of other conditions, but they would be something you'd look for in schizophrenia as well.
Understood. It's a constellation of symptoms that are diagnosed, as opposed to just, one simple test, I guess.
Yeah. And with like diagnostic criteria, there are also timelines attached. Psychosis can be transient episodes. If you have someone who's an active drug user and they're on drugs, they're going to be disconnected from reality. They're going to be experiencing psychosis. They might be hallucinating, right? But it's a transient state rather than a long-term condition.
Right. And as far as timelines, how does schizophrenia normally crop up in a person's life?
So schizophrenia is kind of unique in that there's a standard age of onset or a standard window for age of onset. For men, you would usually see that age of onset earlier, probably as early as late teens into mid-20s is usually when we see onset for men. Women, it usually happens a little bit later, probably mid-20s to early 30s is when you typically expect to see it. It is very, very, very rare to have schizophrenia or any kind of this constellation of symptoms in someone under 18. So it's not something you see in childhood. There are rare cases of them. It's also a lot more rare to see any kind of onset of symptoms post 40. It happens occasionally. In my opinion, it kind of needs the perfect storm of factors to come together to have that kind of late onset. But you'll usually start seeing these behaviors in that kind of age gap. And it does not present with full-on seeing things, hearing things that aren't there. It's often a gradual onset. So people might start behaving differently. They might seek out new peer groups for whatever reason. And when you think about the age that this is typically happening, how is that any different from, a normal guy who's 18, 19, 20, right? Maybe going off to a new environment, going to a different school. It wouldn't necessarily seem atypical for that person to start acting differently or maybe find a new kind of friend group. So it can be very hard to identify and diagnose, especially because the person themselves doesn't feel anything is wrong. So it's a gradual worsening of symptoms. You'll slowly kind of see maybe delusions creep in. Sometimes they might be persecutory delusions, thinking like someone's after you, someone's out to get you, people are against you. It might be, thinking that someone's trying to talk to you through TV or through a song. And these things just kind of gradually get worse until this individual is possibly not able to function the way they were before.
You said that in terms of a later onset, you'd need a perfect storm of factors. What are some of the factors that could lead to an onset later in life?
I would definitely probably need a genetic factor there, some kind of genetic predisposition. I think that would be important. So that would involve knowing someone's history. Does schizophrenia run in the family? So if this person had some kind of genetic predisposition, and then we're put in just the right triggering situation, typically, life factors, how did they grow up? Is there substance use, abuse? Was there any abuse, violence, exposure? And then coming into a specific trauma could potentially trigger it later in life. But it's not just any run-of-the-mill trauma. It might have to be a really specific trauma. So that would differ from person to person.
So with schizophrenia, in terms of how it comes about, it sounds like there's potentially a genetic component and potentially also triggering mechanisms that can kind of unlock it. Is that sort of our current understanding about how some people develop schizophrenia?
Yeah, it's usually thought to have some kind of genetic link and then the right environmental factors. And that's true even for typical onset. Not everyone with a genetic predisposition is going to become schizophrenic.
And those triggers, what could those look like?
It could be anything. Again, trauma, extreme stress, any kind of factor could induce that. Again, violence, growing up in the home, or just even growing up in an unsafe neighborhood, that could, be a factor that kind of sets a person up for having that break at some point down the line. It could be a specific trauma, maybe being robbed at gunpoint. Maybe they're in kind of like a pressure cooker situation at, a university or in a workplace. It's going to differ from person to person. Something that I find traumatic might not actually be interpreted as traumatic for you. So it is very person dependent.
I guess the obvious question in this case is, hypothetically, do you imagine that schizophrenia could be triggered or at least worsened by harsh conditions in a prison?
So those are actually two different things. Someone who has no previous diagnosis, has not been treated, has not engaged in any sort of, treatment medication for schizophrenia, coming into a prison, is it possible for that, prison environment to trigger late onset schizophrenia? And speaking specifically about late onset, just because of the context of where this conversation is coming from with Rick Allen, it's possible. Like it is, I can't tell you with 100% certainty it would never happen. It's possible. I would, in my opinion, say it's highly unlikely for someone who is previously healthy, who has no known family history, hasn't been diagnosed, engaged in treatment of any kind, to suddenly be triggered late in life by going to jail or prison in this case, because I know they are different. Now, for someone who has already been diagnosed, whether they are engaged in treatment, taking medication or not, 100% a prison environment could worsen symptoms because it's an intensely stressful situation. Often routine can be very helpful for people who have mental illness. So I would imagine just the adjustment, being taken away from their routine, put in a new environment, that alone could kind of cause someone to devolve a little bit, if they're already suffering from something.
I want to ask one more question about schizophrenia and then kind of delve into psychosis a little bit more. But, we talked about this a bit, about there being some sympathy with the general public around schizophrenia, people recognizing it's a condition that people can't necessarily always fully control. Mm-hmm. At the same time, you mentioned pop culture can be quite unsympathetic to people with mental illness, and there can be the equation of schizophrenia with violence. And I guess just speaking as a mental health professional, how do you see that sort of equation with mental illness and violence? And I guess, like, if you could speak to that generally, that would be great.
Yeah, I think statistically, people who suffer from mental illness are more likely to be victims of crime rather than perpetrators of crime. And that does not go across the board for every single mental illness, but generally when we're talking about depression, anxiety, even psychotic disorders like schizophrenia, like bipolar, these people are more likely to become victimized because of their inability to interact with the world in the same way someone who isn't having these symptoms and this disconnection from reality would. But because of what they go through, they can sometimes be perpetrators. And I feel like, well, anybody could be a perpetrator of crime in the right circumstance. So I think it's less about the mental illness, about whether someone is going to become violent or perpetrate a crime. It's less about the mental illness and more about that person and their history. I believe there was a recent study that pretty much found the more accurate predictor of someone's propensity to violence is their circumstances, the neighborhood they grew up in, their exposure to different, what we'd consider traumatic events. If you look at people without mental illness who grew up under similar circumstances, the rate of perpetration of crime is about the same between mentally ill and non-mentally ill. So it really is about the circumstances that someone comes from. If you grow up in an area that doesn't have a lot of resources available, that has high rates of crime, if you're seeing crime perpetrated, if you're seeing like a family member committing crime or have a family member that's incarcerated, all of these things, mental illness or not, might predispose you to also becoming a perpetrator of crime. So the mental illness is there, it's a part of it, but it's not necessarily more predictive, in my opinion.
Right. And certainly imposing a societal stigma on mental illness doesn't do any good for anybody regardless, and certainly doesn't help victims of crime. So that's definitely important to note.
Unfortunately, when we talk about kind of pop culture and movie depictions and stuff like that, it's a double-edged sword because you get information, you destigmatize a little when you portray people, especially people in positive light. But then you also have that negative depiction. And unfortunately, in our society, like crime, mass shootings, we're highlighting mental health and the need for mental health care. But at the same time, I think some news organizations kind of shine a light on the fact that this was a mentally ill person that did this. Right? It's because they were mentally ill that they've done this horrible thing. And the mental illness is going to factor in. But again, it's not necessarily helpful in terms of how society in general perceives people with mental illness, if that makes sense.
Certainly. And certainly if you're trying to equate mental illness with, propensity for extreme random violence, it's probably not too helpful in terms of people who are trying to deal with those issues. Exactly.
So there are ways that we're kind of normalizing and decreasing stigma. And I think the focus on mental health, with everything that's been going on, it has served to kind of soften views. I feel like if I'm out on the street, I'm less likely now to see a person cross the street to avoid someone having a conversation with air than I would have been maybe even 5 years ago. I'm in Chicago right now. I'm more likely to see someone go in and buy a blanket, when it's cold outside for someone who's living on the street and is clearly exhibiting symptoms of psychosis. So I feel that the focus that we've kind of put on it more in society does have its good things too. And that's why I said earlier that I think saying schizophrenic can evoke more of a sympathetic response. Whereas 5 years ago, it really was more of a fear response. But that fear response is still present for a large number of people too.
That makes a lot of sense. And kind of to go into the psychosis angle of this, I think I know what the answer is going to be, but is that kind of disparaging or negative view of that Is that fair? It sounds like that's probably not terribly fair to people with some of those symptoms as well, even though obviously fear of violence is understandable in any person. I guess it seems like a complicated issue, but if you could kind of speak to that.
So psychosis can be complicated. And, if I'm speaking honestly, there are some aspects of psychosis that potentially could maybe egg someone on to violence who normally wouldn't be someone who would perpetrate violence. Specifically, sometimes psychosis will present in what we call command hallucinations. A command hallucination is when someone is experiencing maybe voices that are telling them that they need to hurt themselves, they need to hurt someone else. Like, this person is a government spy and they've come to kill you, so you better get them before they get you. You need to do this, you need to do that. So someone experiencing command hallucinations might be a little bit more predisposed to commit an act of violence. But again, not everyone with a command hallucination is going to act on it. In my line of work, I talk to people who are actively experiencing command hallucinations. A story comes to mind. I spoke to a young woman who was actively hearing someone to tell her to kill herself in that moment. And it was very distressing for her. She knew it was something that she didn't want to do, but it was so strong, that impulse, that voice, she felt she had to listen. She was literally sitting there in that moment with weapons in front of her, struggling over, should I listen to them or can I get myself out of this situation? So even for someone who does not want to engage in what they're being told to do, it can get to a point where it's overwhelming. They might act. But even this woman, in that moment when these voices are so strong and overpowering, she still had the presence of mind to think, I don't want to do this. Like, let me try and find another way.
And as you said, there's also that element that may get overlooked when people are just talking about violence, is also violence towards the self, not necessarily exploding, but imploding.
100%. And people with schizophrenia and psychotic symptoms in general, I believe they're a lot more likely to harm themselves than they are to harm other people. The other caveat, I guess, would be if they're feeling directly threatened, right? If you have someone who's disconnected from reality and they're feeling threatened by another person, they have less impulse control. So yeah, they might act on that. But any of us, if we're feeling threatened, would be tempted to act on that, I imagine, in the right circumstances.
When I'm looking at, I guess, some of the topics that are mentioned in this filing that we're talking about around mental health, there is kind of a mention of, the person, the subject of this, Richard Allen, having a history of depression. And does that factor into any of the considerations? Whereas, if some extreme stress like being in a prison could impact somebody with that history in a way that would maybe manifest itself in something more serious than just more depression, maybe something that might look actually psychotic.
So depression is another condition where you can see psychotic features occasionally. It is usually more with major depression, severe major depression, that you would see psychosis. So if he is truly exhibiting some symptoms of psychosis, it could be linked to his depression. He might be a little bit more predisposed to display that because he has a previous diagnosis of depression. But the truth of the matter is that he doesn't need to have any kind of mental health diagnosis to become psychotic. You or me, any one of us can become psychotic, experience psychosis when put in the right circumstances at any point in time.
Understood. So that really, if he is indeed factually experiencing some sort of psychotic state, that doesn't have to be anything more than just being in a situation that is incredibly stressful. It doesn't really have any bearing on guilt or innocence or previous mental health. It could just be a singular experience in that sense.
Correct. And again, as I said earlier, we have no way to say definitively to my knowledge, I don't have the information to say that if he is experiencing psychosis, it is a direct result of the prison environment, because psychosis, again, can be induced by any number of factors. Drugs exist in prisons. If he's using some kind of drug, drugs can induce psychosis. The same with alcohol can induce psychosis. Traumatic brain injuries or some kind of head injury, that can produce psychotic symptoms. Sleep deprivation. Have you ever gone a couple days without sleep and then had trouble thinking and maybe comprehending what was happening around you? I mean, that's, maybe I haven't had that experience since college, but that's something that can happen to anyone in day-to-day life.
Yes, I definitely had that too in college, by the way. So you start almost becoming drunk, essentially, in terms of your behavior.
Exactly. And the longer those circumstances, like the catalyst, persists, the more you're going to devolve and experience that psychosis, whatever symptoms, whether it's a delusion, hallucination. So there are things that can trigger this in the absence of mental illness. So before I would even jump to necessarily mental illness, I would first need to rule out more organic factors. I would need to rule out substance use. Like, those would be the things that I would look at first. And medication is the one that I left out from earlier. I believe that the filing by the defense attorney alluded to, we assume he was assessed and might have been put on medication. If that's true, medication can also produce that kind of effect, a psychotic effect. Not everybody responds to every medication in the best way. So you might start hallucinating or hearing things if you've been put on a new medication, sometimes if the dose is being messed with. So that is a very, real thing that could happen if he is being medicated in prison. Any change in behavior could be from medication issue.
Absolutely. And I guess one thing that we're certainly not saying is going on here, this is all just sort of speculation based on facts. I'm just I think we did get some questions from listeners about this. This possibility that, somebody in a prison or justice system environment could be, essentially faking mental illness, right? Malingering. Mm-hmm. I guess, just given that you do have some experience with the justice system, obviously in a different context, but if you could speak to perhaps how do mental health professionals in that environment try to ensure that they're dealing with somebody who is indeed sincerely dealing with some of these symptoms or mental illnesses rather than someone who's trying to fake it, I guess?
I don't think it's the easiest thing in the world, but when you have someone in front of you, my instinct as a clinician is to try and take people at face value. But if I start hearing inconsistencies, that's when I might start paying more close attention. I might start thinking about, is there something that this person gains by, malingering? That was the correct term for it. In this situation specifically, and this is based on my knowledge of the case, I don't see what he would have to gain at this point by faking a mental illness. Mental illness, and Kevin, I believe you're a lawyer, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but to kind of bring in mental illness would be an affirmative defense. And affirmative defenses are basically saying, yeah, I might have done this, but these are the circumstances, and using that circumstance to kind of assert innocence in a way. Kevin, is that accurate?
That is accurate.
So to bring mental illness would constitute an affirmative defense. And my understanding is that right now they're very strong on factual innocence. So they can't kind of bring mental illness into the equation unless they're giving up that standpoint of, no, I'm innocent. I had nothing to do with this.
Yes, absolutely.
So I don't see that he has something to gain specifically, but I think I also want to take into consideration here that, to my knowledge, it's not Richard Allen who's making this assertion that he's suffering some kind of mental health condition that's in any way impacting him. it's the defense attorney who's made this assertion.
Right.
So that's different to me.
Yes. And yeah, what you said is exactly our understanding, that would essentially be burning the bridge for factual innocence by completely switching over, which I suppose anything is possible in a case that has not yet been adjudicated, but it would mean a pretty intense reversal of sort of what things are shaping up to be so far as the defense goes.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it might be laying the groundwork for like the long game should circumstances change and the defense need to change, kind of planting a seed early. I guess that's out there. It could just be that this is someone who became very concerned at behavior that they saw their client displaying.
Yeah, when you read the filing, it's interesting. It kind of discusses from the attorney's perspective what they were seeing. And basically they acknowledge that like they would describe it as, I believe, schizophrenic and delusional. And it almost read to me as people using terms that, maybe lay people understand to mean one thing, but mental health professionals might say, well, hold on there. Schizophrenia is a constellation of symptoms that need a little bit more than that. So I think that's personally how I read it. But yeah, it's definitely interesting. And I'd be curious about how is he doing now? Like, has this persisted?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if it's true, again, I don't know what the behavior was that they are categorizing in this way. So that was one of my concerns. Like, if I don't know what behavior you're talking about, I don't know that it even falls under that umbrella to begin with. But if he is displaying psychotic symptoms, it could be a result of the environment that he's in. He is in a prison, before he's been convicted. Prisons are very punitive environments. Like, they are punishment. Like, you're there because you are, I guess, trying to pay for whatever it is you did. So it's possible that environment is an intense enough stressor to kind of put him in this state. So the ultimate answer to, can a prison environment potentially cause or induce psychosis in a person, is yes, it could, but that psychosis is only psychosis. It's only psychotic symptoms, unless there are other things present, unless it persists for a certain amount of time. So we don't know that it's indicative of a mental illness. This could be a transient episode of, psychotic symptoms.
Absolutely. And I feel like we've really had a great conversation breaking down, the various possibilities of what we could be seeing here. I suppose going forward, what sort of things will you be looking for, or facts you'll be looking for in future filings or future updates about this case, just as it pertains to possible presence of mental illness or mental health related symptoms?
I'm interested if we'd hear anything more really about his mental state. The goal here really seemed to be to get him moved to a more appropriate environment. I could agree that a jail would be a more appropriate environment for just where this case is. So beyond that, if he gets moved, I don't know that mental health would even be touched on again here, just because from a defense perspective, I just don't see how it would benefit them at this moment in time. So I guess I'd be interested to see if it comes in at all past, assuming that this happens and he does get moved, is it going to be brought up again at all? And if so, in what context? Again, they would have to move to some kind of affirmative defense, in my opinion, to have any grounds to bring it back into the equation.
And as you said, there's always sowing seeds for later, but at the same time, it would mark a pretty extreme shift. And I don't think a lot of people do understand how hard it is to win cases, not guilty by reason of insanity, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
That, that's a pretty high bar to clear.
Yeah. And what a lot of people also don't realize about that, again, there is kind of an admission of guilt in that kind of defense. So even if you were to win that kind of case, and again, Kevin, please correct me if I'm wrong, that doesn't mean you get released and you get to live your life. What that means is you end up in a mental health facility for an indeterminate amount of time. It could end up being that they do get released in a year or two when, a consensus on their health has been reached. It could be they end up spending the rest of their life in that kind of facility. So not only is it hard to win, but I think people don't understand that it's not necessarily a win in the sense that someone walks free if that bar is even, attained.
Absolutely. You don't necessarily get your life back. And as you said, like the risk of basically essentially admitting to something, offering an excuse for why it happened or offering a reason, mental health related reason is one thing, but it's definitely a risky defense. I think people watch, I think it's like pop culture. You watch a show and somebody gets off because they pled insanity, even though they were faking it. And you think, oh no, I hope that doesn't happen, in a case I'm following. But I think that is harder to do than it seems.
Definitely. And I know you brought up malingering. I think it's hard. You would have to have probably a highly intelligent, offender who just had the knowledge to be able to consistently mimic these symptoms and, give the right responses. Most people, if they're malingering, if they're putting something on, they're going to crack, right? I always joke around to people that the reason I don't lie is because I have a horrible memory and I can't remember my lies. So there's no point. I'm going to get caught. Right. And I feel like with malingering, it's the same thing. Like if you can't be consistent, you can't remember what you're supposed to do, those inconsistencies are going to start shining through. So especially if this were to go to court with this kind of defense in the mix, if someone were faking it, if they were malingering, they would have to be pretty intelligent, pretty high functioning to be that consistent.
Right. And or have some sort of very, good knowledge of psychology in order to fake consistently the right symptoms as opposed to accidentally mixing things up and, getting it wrong essentially in front of the experts.
Exactly.
This has been great. I feel like we got through all of our general topics that we've sort of gotten from our audience. I wanted to open it back up to you. Is there anything about this filing or just about the discussion of mental health and mental illness in this case in general that you wanted to speak to or mention or think, the listeners should come away with?
I just think in general, mental health, it is misunderstood. And, there is a lot more to it, even with the conditions people feel that they're familiar with. There's often a lot more there. It's a lot more nuanced. We all have our struggles, whether it's mental illness or something else. So I do think it's best to try and, be sympathetic toward those with mental illness. There's nothing to fear from people who are mentally ill. I think the more that we're able to have these conversations, like open, honest conversations, the more comfort people have with asking for clarification, the better. It just promotes a deeper understanding. I hope, and again, I don't know this attorney's background. I don't know. Maybe he does have experience with behavioral health system. Maybe he has more of a working knowledge. But I would encourage professionals, non-mental health professionals, to also try and be cautious about their language and be a little bit more mindful about what they're saying, what they're asserting, because it's so easy to say something and have it completely misconstrued. Just the word schizophrenic, the presence of that word in this filing, in my opinion, kind of sent people spiraling a little bit in a weird direction, because suddenly like, oh, wait, he's schizophrenic. There's this whole other element to the case when we don't know that. So it is, I think, on professionals to be a little bit more responsible with their language.
Also, as the general public, it probably makes sense for us not to necessarily jump to conclusions about mental health just based on limited information, because there's so much we don't know at this point.
Exactly. I would encourage people, if you're not sure what the full implication of something is, do some research. Like, all you have to do is type schizophrenia into Google, and, the first dozen things that pop up, they're credible resources, National Institutes of Health, Mayo Clinic. Like, you can get a better understanding of some of these things with a simple search. Now, of course, don't believe everything you read on the internet, but when it comes from a credible source, I mean, educate yourself. I encourage everyone to educate themselves when it comes to these things. Another thing also that maybe needs to be said about discussions of mental health is that mental health, we've come a long way in our understanding of mental health and conditions and some of the root causes for some of the conditions, but it's not an exact science. So there are things that we're still learning. Like when we talk about medication, maybe someone's on the wrong medication. We don't always understand enough about brain chemistry to know which medication is going to be effective. We don't always understand the root cause of some of these disorders, So we're talking about genetic factors with schizophrenia, and then I'm talking about environmental factors. So it can be frustrating, I think, to, the lay public for a clinician to come in and not give concrete answers. And it's not because we're trying to frustrate or confuse anyone, but it's nuanced. It's a very nuanced field. You're going to get differences in opinions sometimes from clinician to clinician. There are probably people out there who might not agree wholeheartedly with everything I've had to say. So I think you get that with medicine as well, but to a lesser extent because we have more of a firmer grasp on a lot of medical conditions. There are more defined treatments because treatment in mental health too is variable, talk therapy, medication, sometimes diet will come in treatment of mental illness, believe it or not, but it's not an exact science. A lot of it can be trial and error, and it is highly dependent on a person's investment in treatment when we're looking at success rates, so to speak. So medicine, there's a pill you can give someone, and the pill does the work. As long as you take the pill, your condition's going to clear up. And it doesn't work that way. We're not magicians. We don't have magic wands. So with mental health, a lot of treatment is dependent on that person's dedication to the treatment regimen. Unfortunately, with schizophrenia, you have a lot of people who are non-compliant on their treatment regimens as well. So there's a lot of relapse, to put it in medical terms. You have someone who's taking medication, complying with treatment, and they feel better. They're doing good. They're able to function in daily life, and they think, I'm doing great. I'm fine. I don't need this medicine anymore. I don't have to do this anymore. And they stop taking it. And so those psychotic symptoms, that disorganized thought or behavior, they start seeping back in. So you see a lot of these things too. So that, I think, is another kind of confounding factor for people when they think about mental health is, why can't you just fix it? It's not that easy, and it's highly dependent on that person's investment and their follow through, honestly.
Absolutely. And well said. It's part of you wishes it would just be easier on people if it could just be, okay, take these pills and that's it. But, even with things like anxiety or depression, there's often a lot of experimentation with what sort of medications can even work. If that's the treatment option someone's going for, it's not necessarily going to immediately be a good thing. And, side effects are a thing. I mean, it's so complicated.
Definitely. My exposure to just the penal system, they don't always go with maybe the newest, I guess we can put it in that term, medical interventions. Prisons a lot of time will use more of the old school medications, especially when it comes to psychotic disorders. It's like Halidol, those really heavy drugs that will knock a person out and kind of turn them into a zombie, so to speak. That's what you would think of with those, rather than new antipsychotic medication, which doesn't have that kind of really restrictive effect. It's not the exact right term to put it. You get what I'm trying to say here.
I think so. And it's a matter of, maybe it's not keeping up with the times, but I think in a prison, maybe there is more of an incentive to want people to be compliant.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. But what we know about some of those old school medications is, for some, they're very effective and might be the best course of treatment, but they can have more serious medical side effects as well. Lithium, for example, you take lithium, you have to get your blood tested every so often because it could have serious effects on your body. So while it might be helpful for some people under the right circumstances, I don't always think those are the best go-to in that scenario. But it might be a cost thing. Honestly, I have no clue if that's accurate. So
right, yeah,
but that's speculation.
Yeah, it could be any number of reasons, honestly, but yeah, I'll believe it, and that tracks with one of the former inmates of Westville was talking to us about how, people who were on medication would kind of seem more listless than some of the other people there, maybe a bit more drugged up, I guess, and yeah. Well, listen, this has been a great chat, and I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to discuss some of this with us.
Yeah, definitely. I listen to the podcast. I'm invested in the case. I'm from Indianapolis.
Yeah.
I live in Chicago now, but I'm from Indianapolis. I've never been to Delphi, but it's not that far. So
no, it's not. Yeah, that's so cool. I'm from New York originally. Kevin's from Columbus, Indiana, but we live in the Indianapolis area now, so we're very much invested in Indy. But yeah, it's the case that's just kind of people are obsessed with around here, and it's understandable because it's so horrible. But I think emotions are really high right now that someone's been arrested, and our attitude is like, we feel like without knowing more, we're not going to come down on like, oh, he's definitely guilty or oh, he's definitely innocent. Like let's hear the case unfold and hopefully get to the truth,
Yeah, and I really respect that about you guys, is that I feel that you take a lot of caution with what you report, and you're not trying to put anything out there that might adversely impact someone if you don't have enough to back it up.
Yes. Well, thank you.
You're not in it for like the gossipy hits, and I respect that a lot.
Yeah, well, we really appreciate that. And so with Alan, it's kind of like, it's kind of interesting to see it. It's like he could be malingering. He could be someone who does not have mental illness, but as you said, he's dealing with this kind of crisis. And you can imagine if he's an innocent man, that is incredibly traumatizing. Mm-hmm. But if he's a guilty man and he's locked up there with his own guilt, then that also could be traumatizing. And it just kind of, it's like, who knows? But it's definitely an interesting situation. But it's an upsetting one because you'd hope that they wouldn't want somebody like losing their mind in prison. Hopefully this will be corrected, I guess, behind the scenes. But it's just been a weird development in the case.
Yeah, like regardless of what's going on, I would hope that the judge or, whoever is in the place to kind of make these decisions really takes it seriously and sees that he's getting the care he needs. So if he truly is experiencing some of these things, he's getting treatment, he's being put on the right medication. If there is any kind of threat to his personal safety, that he's being watched appropriately. So I hope that the result of this is that this person, regardless of what he may or may not have done, gets the care that he needs. I think that's what's one of the key things here.
Thanks so much to Sarah for her insight. We appreciate her taking the time to talk to us about these topics in mental health.
Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening.